Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Liz Williams. I'm a senior lecturer in the School of Cybernetics at the ANU, and I'm also the manager of the Algorithmic Futures Policy Lab. This event is co-organized by the ANU School of Sociology and the Algorithmic Futures Policy Lab team, which includes a collaboration between the ANU Center for European Studies, the ANU School of Cybernetics, ANU Fenner School, the Center for Discrete Mathematics and Theoretical Computer Science at Rutgers, and CNRS LAMSAD in Paris. We're here today to launch Benedetta Brevini's new book, Is AI Good for the Planet? My colleague, Professor Catherine Daniel, will introduce Benedetta shortly. Benedetta will give you a talk, and then you'll all have the opportunity to ask her questions after that. First, though, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the European Commission for their support of the Algorithmic Futures Policy Lab through the Erasmus Plus program. I also need to share this disclaimer. I'll give you a minute to read that. Finally, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the lands on which we meet today. For me, that's the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. And I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. I'll turn things over to Professor Catherine Daniel, who leads the Algorithmic Futures Policy Lab and has a joint appointment in the ANU School of Cybernetics and ANU Fenner School. She's also an associate of the ANU Center for European Studies. Thank you, Catherine.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Liz. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. And thank you all for joining us. I would like to acknowledge the unceded and sacred Ngunnawal and Ngambri lands where I am this evening as well, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I think this acknowledgement of country is really important as we think about questions of technologies and their impacts to ensure that the mistakes of the past are not repeated and we develop our technologies in respectful and sustainable ways. So this evening, we're delighted to be launching Benedetta Brevini's new book, Is AI Good for the Planet? The book, which is published this year by Polity, explores the material aspects of AI, the energy, the raw materials, the water, the land, and the potential impacts our growing reliance on AI-driven technologies may have on our environment. For those of us working on the Algorithmic Futures Policy Lab and many of us beyond it with an interest in sustainability, I think this story is one of many we hope to thread together to catalyse the work needed to successfully design technology and policy for an uncertain future. I'm going to ask Benedetta to introduce her new work in a minute, but for those of you who haven't yet met her, I wanted to give you a little background. Benedetta Brevini is a journalist, a media activist, and an associate professor of communication at the University of Sydney. She holds visiting fellowships at the Centre for Law, Justice and Journalism at City University London, at WZB in Berlin, and at the Centre for Media, Data and Society at the Central European University in Budapest. Before joining the Academy, she worked as a journalist in Milan, New York, and London for CNBC and RAI. And she currently writes on The Guardian's Comment is Free, contributes to a number of print and web publications, and is the author of several books. Is AI Good for the Planet is her latest work, so please join us in welcoming Benedetta.
Thank you everybody, and thank you Catherine for the great introduction, and of course to Liz, to Beck and to Gavin for hosting this event and facilitating this talk. I'm really delighted to be talking about this topic tonight, especially in light of the conclusion of COP26 that only happened a couple of weeks ago. But first I want to start by sharing the screen, and let's see if I succeed with that. I think that what is really crucial when we try to approach the connection between artificial intelligence and the planet and the climate crisis that we're all facing, is important to start by considering and thinking what the 2 years of the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, has taught us. So now we are reliant as ever on technology. And we saw, especially in the last 2 years, the massive acceleration on the adoption of AI, big data, cloud computing, video technologies. So we eat, we socialize, we give lectures, we present books constantly online, and we're constantly plugged in the cloud. And there is a very interesting new research just published by Mika around UK that showed, for example, that for the first time in 2020, video conferencing has surpassed email as the most widely used form of business communication. So we are reliant on communication systems as ever before. And as communication policy reformer, we should start asking, what does it all mean for the planet? What does it mean when all universities move online, when we constantly teach, as you can see in one of the examples from my class during the year, during the lockdown? What does this mean then for the climate crisis that we are all facing, if this is the new pattern of our social life? And so, I mean, I think that the starting point of this conversation really should be that we don't have much time. And I have a tweet by Michael Mann, a climate scientist that has been very vocal during COP26, that once again, if we forgot about it, is reaffirming that the emission during the pandemic, although we've been constantly bombarded by media reports that were stating that the emissions were falling down, on the contrary, they only fell down in a limited way, about less than 4 to 7% during 2020. And in fact, what we should always remember instead is that in order to win this battle and in order to be sure that we don't go over the famous 1.5 threshold, we need to cut the emissions by 50% in the next decade. That means, of course, by 2030. And yet, as I said, despite all the lockdowns, we saw that while the carbon dioxide emissions fell by as much as 17% in April 2020, immediately as the world started coming back to normality, to a form of normality, we have this incredible gain in carbon emission. And the interesting thing, of course, is that we saw that the transportation and all industrial activity declined from January 2020. But of course, the constant electricity consumption that was generated by our reliance, of course, also our reliance of communication systems instead, generated this new balance, right? And according to the World Energy Outlook 2019, we should always remember that globally, the 64% of the global electricity mix comes from fossil fuels. So what do we make of this? Like, if most of the if fossil fuels are actually the way in which we are constantly fostering the electric grid, and we are constantly, in terms of our energy production, relying on fossil fuels, then we should be starting thinking about this, but also in the connection with these communication systems that we're constantly incredibly dependent on. So that's where my starting point and the starting point for this topic on the connection between artificial intelligence and the climate crisis became very relevant for my research. So the way in which, if we are constantly reliant on communication systems, how do we make sense of the climate crisis? How do we react to this? And to what extent we are considering the climate crisis when we are thinking of shaping this new communication age, right? So, and it all started, so my thinking around these topics really started back in around 2015, 2014, when we first held a workshop where we tried to call upon also communication scholars, try to make sense of the new communication technologies and the environment. And we did so in this first book, Carbon Capitalism, where we really explain how relevant and important it was for communication scholarship and communication policy making to start embracing and focusing on the materiality of communication systems. And so, and this is what we set to do, and this is a disciplinary matter, because we decided to really start focusing on the way in which communication systems run on machines and infrastructure that constantly deplete scarce resources in their production, in their consumption, and in disposal, thus increasing amount of energy in their use and exacerbating problems, generating the climate crisis. And again, my thinking during the pandemic, of course, got more confirmation of this, starting point and hypothesis that I had in mind when I saw, for example, this great study by Belkir and Elminigi that in 2018 they were already estimating that the tech industry carbon footprint could increase at this level to over 14% of the global emission by 2040. Again, because of what I said at the beginning, which is the constant reliance of our energy production on fossil fuels at about over 65%. So this estimate, of course, should make us all think. And of course, of all of this estimate, we should remember the data centers actually make up, according to their estimate, and will make up about 45% of the entire footprint, while the network infrastructures, for example, will be making up about 24% of all of this stake of global emission. So the question that I suppose that I wanted also social scientists and people engaged in communication research to engage with was immediately what are the environmental costs and damages of the current data-driven communication systems. And why also is communication policy constantly neglecting this question? So, and in fact, if we look at definitions, and if we look at the way in which we try to conceive AI, is there a place for AI in this thinking around communication systems as materialities, communication systems as assemblages of machine? Can we then reconfigure and identify and understand AI in this way? So if we go to a definition, I would say that probably one of the biggest hurdles that I had during the years was trying to find a definition that would satisfy colleagues and computer scientists with, IT engineers, with AI developers, something that was, in a way, comprehensive enough to really trying to define what I mean and also to try to define the problem. And I guess that this was one of the major hurdles at the beginning, and something that made me interview an incredible quantity of people and experts in the field. But I would say that one of the constant mainstream definition of AI was always this idea of artificial intelligence defined as the ability of machines to mimic and perform human cognitive functions. And this, of course, would include the reasoning, the learning, the problem solving, the decision making, and even the attempt to match elements of human behavior, such as creativity and emotions. And I wasn't particularly happy with this definition. It was quite mainstream and very often adopted in computer science handbooks, for example. And so I kept looking for a definition that was actually more useful to start and kick off an understanding of AI in connection with the climate emergency. And in fact, even in my scholarship, like a field that is highly reliant on political science, anthropology, political economy, and of course, like cultural studies, they're all connected. I would say that I saw especially new definitions coming from human-machine communication that were really focusing a lot on the creation of meaning among humans and machine, and development theory related to people interactions with technologies such agents and robots, but again, not much on the materiality of the technology. And then I started reviewing all the white papers and the discussion, the debate that took place at the European level. And I found actually definition that I found particularly useful for the task that I was about to embark. So like in the EU paper on artificial intelligence, we see AI defined, and I think very successfully, as collection of technologies that combine data, algorithm, and computer power. And therefore, I find also the acknowledgement that it is the advances in computing and the increasing availability of data and data capitalism that can define the incredible success of AI, the incredible rush to adopt AI, and in this concept of constantly data-driven practices by the industry. And I thought that actually this definition was very promising for what I was set out to do. And therefore, I really relied on this policy definition to come up with a concept and a definition of AI in which AI is approached as assemblages of material devices and infrastructures. And in doing so, I rely strongly on a political economy of communication theorist, Vincent Mosco, that in a book, The Next Internet, identifies the component of this next internet as cloud, datification, and the Internet of Things, all crucial components of the way in which I define AI that can really help us understanding AI in the context of the climate crisis. But, most importantly, finally, this eureka moment, this epiphany that, helped me finally moving forward in this research was led to the fact that through this definition, I was able also to dispel a lot of the myth that we see constantly being very often also adopted to explain metaphors that are used also to explain difficult concepts in the context of policy debates. And very often AI in this mythical way is offered as the great solution to the challenges of our age, because it will allow us to address any sort of problem, any sort of chronic disease, to address problems related to the pandemic, repairing the economy, managing social services, and of course, anticipating all cybersecurity threats. And finally, solving the climate crisis. And so going back to the materiality and to the way in which AI is highly connected to the machines and the assemblages and the infrastructures and the cables and everything that is material and the devices that are produced through scarce resources and very often through data colonizing policies that constantly extract from the global south, well, then we can move on and try to understand what to do about it. And of course, so embracing a material concept of AI allows me and allowed me really to finally dispel the myth that we know are a constant when new technologies are introduced. And I have a brilliant quote by Vincent Mosco here that reminds us how every generation, one after another, has renewed the belief that what we said about an early technology, well, we kind of forget what we said, but we know that the new technology will fulfill some revolutionary promise. And of course, I couldn't help but thinking of Gilda's definition, of Negroponte's definition of the internet, when they were claiming that they would see a new Athenian age of democracy landing over us and bringing us freedoms and new opportunities in a way that now we tend to forget. And so something similar, of course, is happening also through AI. And we are here as critical scholar, trying to understand if this definition can be useful or not. And in my view, embracing the material definition of AI is helping us precisely dismantling this myth and therefore reappropriating, the crucial materiality of this communication technology in relation to the climate crisis. And of course, I had to have a slide here about, something that is now becoming quite, an interesting set of policies on climate change, also in Australia, where technology, not taxes, are believed to be the way, to move forward without changing the status quo. So in a way, this mythical thinking around artificial intelligence and technology has sometimes delayed action and has led to, a wait and see moment that at the moment we cannot really afford, because as I said at the very beginning, we only have a decade to reduce the emissions by 50% in order to think that maybe we can still limit the carbon emission to the 1.5 that is so crucial to avoid constant weather events and disasters and climate disasters. So having appropriated, and found the right definition for AI, the definition that helps me with this theoretical framework to move forward and make these connections, we can now understand AI in a way that it relies on technologies, machines, and infrastructures that, of course, deplete scarce resources in their supply and production chain. So from production to consumption and disposal. And of course, all the problems that are generated that we must debate now. We cannot postpone the debate in 10 years time, because as said, now we have an emergency, and now we have, a problem that needs to be addressed. And is also reflected by the fact that, they decided at COP26 to have another COP27 because of the urgency and because of the discussions that were not, embraced and were not, taken further in the debate in COP26. So just to clarify, and summarize also, I know I'm also mindful of time, the 4 ways in which we should consider the connection between AI and the climate crisis. So I see, and I love, to create schemes and trying to really understand, the 4 ways in which AI is impacting the climate crisis. And of course, we have to start with the idea of the way in which computational power of algorithms is creating a problem. And we have this fantastic research that has been done in 2019 and has been, in media coverage quite a lot around the globe by the College of Information and Communication of Computer Science at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, that quantified the energy consumed by running artificial intelligence programs. Now, I know that we are, in a school where, we have experts in the field, and, I'm sure I don't need to explain to you what a neural network is, and also the computational power that is needed to generate. And we know that these are generalizations that could be dangerous, but they are a very good way to start having a conversation about this problem, because what this research has revealed is the incredible size of the problem. And this is why I'm very keen to use this type of research. And so what I did, I basically used the data from the research that showed how a common training model in linguistics, so a very common training model that could be used by Google Translate, for example, could actually emit more than 284 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. Now, I normally talk to the public, to communication scholars, and to non-expert, non-computer experts. And making sense of the 284 tons was not that easy. And this is why this is a difficult also field to master, because we need to understand each other. We need to collaborate with environmental scientists, with computer scientists, and try to make sense of this number. So in order to simplify things, like all of this, so the 284 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent is comparable to 5 times the lifetime emissions of the average American car, but it's also comparable to roughly 100 return flights from London to New York City. And meanwhile, the converged communication systems upon which AI relies generates also extra environmental problems. But I wanted to reflect on this data. So if you consider, a typical flight London to Rome, the emissions would be around 234 kilograms. But if we consider an average, algorithm using, neural networks, we see that the production would be 284,000 kilograms. So this data, and I know that we cannot generalize on this data. I know that there are neural networks that at the moment are sustainable. I know that there is research that is really working in this direction, but we need more, because the reality is that we have this deadline and the climate emergency is not going to wait for us. So we need to intervene soon on this data and this energy consumption. So, and this is only the beginning of, the environmental cost and the first way in which AI is impacting on the climate emergency. Then secondly, we have to remember, of course, that AI constantly relies on data to work. And of course, and this is possibly the most debated theme already, the sustainability of data centers. On average, and these are data from Nature 2018, an international agency, the data centers used around the world average 200 terawatt hours a year. And this is just to give you an idea, because again, as communication scholars or as tech policymakers, we might not see this in comparison perspective. And so it's, very close to the consumption, to the energy consumption of smaller countries, but including, for example, Iran. And the problems of the data centers, of course, does not end with the energy consumption. It ends, it of course entails also problem with the cooling, of the system and the water supply. And we have experts also tonight that are currently really studying also this issue, and how do we make sense that we are sustainable in managing the data centers if this amount and quantity of water are necessary to cool down the systems. And actually, it's very interesting. If you go on the website of Google DeepMind, they acknowledge that that's, the primary source of energy used in data center is cooling. And of course, this is another, combined and crucial problem of, the AI relationship to the climate emergency. But it doesn't end here, of course, because once the devices that are powered through AI are discarded, and of course, this is also true if we think of, anything around the Internet of Things. If you think of your new smart refrigerator that is powered by Alexa and that will tell you that you forgot to buy a crucial good and reminds you of that, where are these devices ending? And of course, this is also highly connected to all the problems of obsolescence and all the problems of the right to repair, for example. But, in terms of the disposal, these devices all end up, unfortunately, in the most, underdeveloped countries in the world, the countries that at the moment are struggling with vaccine because of the usual problem with the continuous type of colonization that unfortunately is still very evident. And also it's evident in the development of AI. And so these are the countries like Bangladesh, or the so-called, as I like to call them, the colonies of the colonies. So, like, for example, Cambodia and Bangladesh are at the moment the so-called e-waste dump in the world. So what are the costs also of transporting these highly dangerous goods to the colonies that are suffering, and what are the costs for the populations that are forced to live in this highly polluted environment? And so, of course, this is the third way in which there is a connection to be made and a reflection to be made in terms of policymaking about the connection between AI and the climate change. And fourthly, of course, something that I wasn't really entirely expecting when I started collecting materials for the book, especially because I tend to, for years, I've been looking at comparatively at European debates, and of course, trying to understand what debates around technology in the Asia Pacific look like, but always comparing them with Europe. And of course, what I saw, was a very, very brilliant debate around AI-powered weapons, and the idea that banning them was crucial since the very beginning of the conversation of AI. Unfortunately, while we see in the draft legislation coming from the EU, we see very clearly a list of the high-risk applications of AI that we should always, do and treat with care, I would say. What is absolutely missing is, for example, a ban on this type of AI-developed application, which are due absolutely to increase the efficiency of the extractionism from the gas and oil industry. And this is really something that has surprised me, especially when you look at the size of incredible profitable business where, for example, the sector of AI in oil and gas is expected to reach over $4 billion globally by 2025 from only 1.75 billion in 2018. So, I mean, these are, and of course, there will be time in the Q&A also to discuss this further if you're interested, but these are the four ways in which I see that, AI is interlinked with the climate crisis. And of course, I think that what is really crucial is that we also try to think of solutions. We try to think of ways in which exactly what are the values that should guide us in the development of AI at the moment, considering that we know that we're facing a climate emergency. How to bring this debate that are highly nation-based in the context of COP26? How do we make them more global? And so I tried in the book to offer solutions, and I just want to conclude by mentioning a few of the solutions, because what I really believe needs to happen is that we need to consider that there is not just one intervention that can save us and from the climate crisis. Of course, when it concerning AI, what we need to do is to start having a conversation of the ownership and the control of these infrastructures that power artificial intelligence. So who are the companies? And this is an answer, this is a question that I pose in the book, and I try to answer. Who are the major companies, the so-called digital lords, as I like to call them, that are at the forefront of AI and demand more transparency, because we need to know the level of the state capture, the corporate capture coming from policymaking in this. Are we really free to decide on these developments, considering their impact on the climate emergency? So starting with a reapplication of transparency in terms of the ownership and infrastructures of the big digital lords that are controlling AI at the moment. And of course, it would be very important, to consider something like a green tech label that could be easily attached to all devices and applications that are powered to AI. Because, as engineers and computer scientists can easily try to quantify the computational power of AI, and so we need. As citizens, as consumers, we need to know the extent of the computational power that is used and what are the carbon emissions of a device that we're using, of an application that we use. So, demanding more transparency in this. At the same time, I always believe in the importance of green tech literature and green media literature. It is crucial that we start pushing important greening of curricula at the high school level, at the university level, to try to raise awareness. Because, of course, it's really important also to know the type of behavior that can lead to some decision making. And of course, we see the way in which pressure on the big digital lords, so like Apple, like Amazon, like Microsoft, but also the ones in Asia, has led to the adoption of policies that are more sustainable. It happened with Google and Microsoft with the data centers. It's happening now, just a few weeks back, with Apple for the first time, trying to foster a right to repairability, which has always been a crucial issue for e-waste and the disposal of devices. And of course, what is really crucial is that we are, able to participate in embracing an agenda that is actually less limited to an ethical framework that overlooks completely the environmental question. And so reestablishing an agenda that looks more at environmental justice, reestablishing also an agenda that takes on board the indigenous legacy that is at the moment, leading us to a reflection, not taking for granted the data colonialism that is per se, embedded in AI, is something that we should really start talking about. And I hope that the questions will go also into this direction. So thank you very much for the opportunity, and I'm very happy to answer the questions you might have. Thank you.
Well, wonderful. Thanks so much, Benedetta, for sharing all of those, some really important insights from the book, and also kind of establishing this call to action. I think there's a huge amount of food for thought there. And so what we might do is actually open up to the floor straight away for questions and get this debate started. So there are a number of ways that you can join in. First, you can put questions in the chat. You may also raise your hand. And Liz will come to you and allow you to speak. I think at that point you may also put your video on if you would like to be on the recording. If not, you can just ask your question or put it in the chat. Wonderful. Now, Maria Teresa, I don't know whether that is a hand or whether that is just congratulations. And I'm very happy with uncomfortable silences. I know many of you have questions, so we will just wait. And hope that you can actually put your hands up. All right, wonderful. Parichi, would you like to ask your question? Liz, are you able to? Yep, great.
Oh, thank you, Catherine. Hi, Benedetta. Good evening, and I'm joining in from Melbourne. So this is an ill-formed question, just off the cuff. So going forward, how about the analytics consulting companies? Do they opt for computationally less intensive models? You know, in the process of analytics consulting, claim that their services are green compliant as opposed to chasing profits. Would that be a good thing to pursue in the future?
Absolutely. Actually, I mean, this would be one of the starting point. As I said, I think that through mechanisms such as the World Information Society Forum or even, COP26, we could really try to enforce, agreements that are, to be valid at the national level and then internationally for example, demand that there is transparency, precisely on the computational power that is used to train these algorithms. And, analytical companies and also brokers, for example, have a right to join in. But the problem is that at the moment, all of this is highly privatized and protected also by property rights, right? So it's very difficult also for the public, but also for researchers to access, some data. And this is something that we all face whenever we are, for example, trying to study and investigate what happens in terms of the greenwashing of big media, digital lords or big global corporations, right? So to make sense of the numbers, to make sense of the claims for graining. And also, I think that another way would be really to try to request that the so-called zero carbon emission pledge are not just based on mathematics and credits and carbon credits, but they're based on actual, action. Because we know, because I saw major studies that have been done by computer scientists, and we know that there is a way to start actually using less computational power, also in neural networks. And we know that some of the most advanced ones are trying to achieve, these goals, but they need really to be highly pushed in this direction. And in order to do so, sometimes it's difficult when you have just connections, for example, between the researchers and the industry without enough transparency to see actually what is the direction that is taking. Like if you have, a project that is only completely funded by the industry, an industry that of course is hungry for profits because it's the nature of the business, then we need to make sure that we demand this green, for example, tech certificate, in order to know the numbers and to know what is the kind of computational power that is used. I mean, there are some applications of AI that, in my view, do not show the promise of the public interest. So we, at this point, we need to also decide that some applications, as much as the European Commission has decided that AI-powered weapons are not good for the world and for citizens in the world, we could decide that there are some applications that are too consuming and are also probably not going in the direction of saving the planet. And so we should make these decisions. I don't think that actually should be that difficult, but I know that one of the first steps is to demand accountability, because of course, then the problem always becomes to what extent current global policymaking in this area is impacting, by who are the stakeholders that are impacting this policymaker. I mean, when I see that the Federal Trade Commission in the US is finally deciding and pushing for, getting rid of this terrible and almost unchallengeable policies of obsolescence that led to this consumerism that has led to this high consumption of devices in a way that we can never repair them. The intervention that they've done is very important, and it has been done, in the public interest and in the interest of the public to save the planet, because we're living through a climate emergency. So this is what we should be doing, putting the climate emergency at the center of our developments and policymaking of AI.
Beautiful, thank you. I just had a quick question to piggyback is, what about just your thoughts on personalization? So there's so much of, in the insurance space, you have the claims level modeling, and the algorithms are targeting personalized response and care. So just your thoughts on, how do we balance environment and personalization? So do we not process that much and then take a back seat and say, hey, let's not get too much. Let's focus on the environment. And
well, I think that actually, if you lead, it's always a balance, right? Isn't it? It's important, like, I think also case by case, to try to assess what is really the benefits of the type of application that we are implementing, and what are the damages for the specificity also of the land in which we are operating. So if you look at, the Vandana Shiva movement, right, for lands and for seeds, okay, you will see that there is this quest for protecting the local activities, or the local ground. And then you think, okay, but is AI going to help us, in developing these activities? What is it? Well, what do they need? They need really help in trying to protect the farmers at the local level, the indigenous activities at the local level. Is it really that AI is going to change their life completely? Probably what we should aim at would be to put really the sustainability first, and then decide to what extent we can redesign. But the problem is that designing for data-driven profit is what we've been done in the last years. And that is the issue. If we started with the climate emergency, maybe we would not even have started developing such applications. So it's really, we need to really change our framework and our, the starting point in our thinking.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you, Benedetta.
Thank you. I think we have another question from Beck now.
Great, thanks for an excellent talk, Benedetta, and I'm really looking forward to reading the book. It's a confession that I haven't yet. I was hoping I could have before the event, but I really want to now. I wanted to draw you out a little bit on where you think a public politics of a socially and environmentally just AI industry or sector might go. Because I'm hearing a couple of things from you. Like one, some of your comments make me think, okay, so this is, if it's about policy making, then, what's your view on the forms of externality management that already exist, right? There's no shortage of sort of approaches to internalising externalities, like the waste footprint of tech industries. So interested in what you think there. But picking up on the sense of climate emergency that you're rightly putting forward, I think that actually pushes a vision for an environmentally and socially just AI further in, in thinking through what the role of the state might be here, and some of the problems in asking for, if you like, a kind of publicly owned and operated AI. So the second question really is, what does a democratic AI industry look like? What does a state look like that uses AI for good? And how does, where are the movements that you see that might have potential for demanding that on a presumably democratic basis? These are big questions. I feel like we're asking them all over the place, so I don't expect you to
No, there are very, very important
but,
questions.
yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There are questions that have been tormenting me, at least in the last 5 years, I would say, and trying to answer those is important, and you might even help me. So I think that in terms of the policy making it is true that there are a variety of initiatives, but many of these initiatives are based often on self-regulation mechanisms, as you know. So, and very often they are really not binding. Okay, so what's happening is that AI, as much as the climate crisis, and in this they're connected, are global phenomena, right? So in my view, like having an intervention that is only limited to the nations will not necessarily work. Why? Because we should really start by policy making that looks at the ownership, that looks at where, you know, the major owners and digital lords like developing AI live and operate. And I would tell you that if you read the book, you will see that they are global already. And of course, we know that it's, you know, the West with the US, there's a challenge in China in the East. And so there is this incredible consolidation of a global you know, digital market. That is something that could have been avoided. And I still believe that, and I'm not the only one, because if we look at the previous platform that was launched before the US election, and they were constantly claiming that it was important to fracture and trying, you know, to separate the different activities, for example, of the digital lords, so the platforms of the West. And, you know, and this was also the platform that has been taken up by Bernie Sanders at some point, you know, so it was already in the public debate, this idea. And I think that should be, so the idea of a structural reform that is enforced through policymaking is the starting point. But of course, then we have this forum like COP26, where all states meet. And in those contexts, there is an opportunity to have agreements that, you know, we're becoming more binding in a way that, you know, if we pledge to achieve certain goals, I mean, we deliver and we check on all the states that are delivering or not, as it's happening now with Australia, that has been, you know, named and shamed, unfortunately, at COP26, for example. So the idea that, for example, pushing for transparency means to adopt these global green tech labels that at the moment are not non-existent. So, you know, there are incredible, and this I'm moving here towards your second question, there are incredible examples at the level of the industry-led activism, at the level of the conglomerates and the digital giants that are very promising. So these workers that are, you know, working in the tech workers alliances, for example, are coming up with ideas that are very useful and are going in a direction because they are presenting their own companies with ideas on trying to green, but not green to the usual tricks, you know, the usual mathematics of the carbon credits, really trying to reduce the carbon footprint of the neural networks, really trying to find systems to power all data centers through solar and to wind. And these are real examples. And then bringing all these contributions also to a forum like COP26, for me, would be the starting point. But I found that is highly difficult. And it is something that probably also because of the interdisciplinarity of your institutes and all involved tonight, for example, you see that sometimes global environmental policymaking doesn't talk with global AI policymaking and global AI, even at the level of the Council of Europe, where there has been an exciting developments, you know, and discussion. So I suppose that an AI, I mean, I think what I want to present is a form of AI that is for environmental justice in a way that the values of environmental justice are embedded within an AI. And so we start from that perspective because we equate the climate emergency with the public interest. So, you know, before having the climate emergency, which has been now for almost a century, basically, but before then, we could only talk about developing technology for the public good and in a democratic way, right? But now we can really think in terms of developing AI for the climate emergency, which of course leads to a more democratic AI. I mean, I am in favor of trying, you know, I'm pragmatic, okay? So, I mean, although I am someone that really believes in public service, and I think strongly that we wouldn't have Facebook or Google the way we have them at the moment if we developed them in the 50s, we would have something more similar to the ABC or to the BBC, because the ideas of trying to share a resource that is a public good resource were very present in public policy. So if we developed AI back then, we would have certainly considered the public interest much more, and we wouldn't have let just the industry develop in it. So having said that, I think that we need to get stakeholders from the industry, policymakers, climate policymakers on board or equally involved, but we need also a strong alliances of states at the global level that will enforce such policies, because the industry alone is already showing they're not delivering. So I hope I answered, and I tried to answer your questions. Very important.
Yeah, no, you did, and more than thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We have Gavin with the next one.
Hi, Benny. I'll leave my video off because the connection is not great, but hopefully you can hear me okay. But thank you so much for such an amazing presentation, and I'm also looking forward to reading the book as well, so congratulations on that. I guess my question is more about maybe an observation, but I was just kind of thinking about smart cities and how much of the symbolic, discursive aspects of smart cities are about we need to embed AI into them to make them, smarter than the dumbness that they were before. And I guess, there's an interesting aspect in your work where you're looking at the materiality of these things, but how that kind of rubs up against these kind of promissory stories of AI as being the salvation of all the crises that we're facing. And so I guess that seems to be, a tension that in order to become better cities, more advanced cities, we need more and more technology embedded into them. But that technology, as you've beautifully articulated, is causing all sorts of unintended consequences. So that's one part. The other part, I guess, is just a more simple question around, whether you see your work really kind of interfacing with the actual technicians and engineers of these kinds of algorithms and codes, and how you feel they would read your book, and just kind of interested in that sense, and how much you've worked with them on their realization of what they're kind of contributing to, albeit inadvertently. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you. Two very interesting questions as well. I mean, I think that the myth making around smart cities fascinates me as much as the myth making around technology and AI. And it's really the starting point of my investigations, because, I mean, of course, in the history of technology, and I'm leaning on Peter Carey, but, also the fabulous series and books by Gilles Lepore, who has been really strongly showing the way in which the ideologies of Silicon Valley have been, very present in all the developments around technology since the beginning, but even before. And we can actually, I was talking to an historian of Illuminism the other day, and we were thinking probably we should do something together, because those ideas were incredibly embedded in ideas of capitalism. So the ideas of progress, technology leading to progress and making capitalism work, right? So this all said, for me, the starting point was precisely trying to say, okay, wait a minute. So these technologies are really these artificial, fluffy, beautiful entities that will come and will reach us even though we don't want them. So is the cloud really as fluffy, beautiful, and white in a blue sky really the way it's represented or does it have a material component, right? So like the promises of the smart cities, of course, are actually another great example of these ideologies at work, and that are leading to this common sense for which we stop questioning the fact that this type of materialities might have an environmental impact. So this is really where, and this is why the thinking is developing in this direction, because actually I think that the biggest missing point precisely of this incredible common sense and myth making around technology that we have seen throughout the history of technology the missing question was always the environmental and the sustainability question. So even the concept of sustainability, I would challenge that. But that doesn't mean that we can't, try to achieve, something that is actually more greener, than the way it is now. And then this leads me to the second question. I've been working and interviewing a lot of computer scientists and IT person, because really for me, even trying to understand the incredible extension, like what AI truly means, and why do we use to so many different applications, and we refer to them and to an array of them like AI. What does it mean? And actually, I had to rewrite one chapter on the book in which I try to offer the definition something like 15 times, because all the computer scientists I was sending the drafts to would actually have something to add and something to really claim that what I was doing was not quite right. So yes, and what's happening at the moment after doing a few book launches, actually, over 10 book launches, I have so many computer scientists that are really interested in trying to incorporate these ideas in the beginning. So as they start designing these applications, they are starting considering these questions, and they put the question at the beginning. And I think that that's really the kind of answer that we have. I don't think that we should stop any, development in the public good, but we should pose the environmental question first and then develop the technology and ask ourselves, to what extent is this coherent? Can we afford this in light of the climate emergency? And many computer scientists are very happy to consider this. It's just that we need to have these collaborative conversations so that they can think about this. And this is why it's important to have these debates that are very multidisciplinary, because when we repair to our shelters and sheltered lives in our silos, academic silos, or even in the silos of policy debates, like COP26, the debates around technology were almost non-existent. It is incredible.
And I think that's actually a wonderful last question and set of provocations for us to finish on. So I would like to thank everyone here for those questions, but most of all to Benedetta for coming here tonight and for sharing your work with us. If our participants here haven't yet bought a copy of your book, we might do a little bit of promotion for you. I might ask Liz to actually put the link in the chat so that people can have a look. And the other thing is, if you would like to hear more from Benedetta and to continue this discussion, she's kindly agreed to be one of our keynotes at our next workshop on the social responsibility of algorithms, which will be held online in June 2022. And that's really to look at some of those big policy questions that we've been talking about and the algorithmic futures. So for more on that, please follow us at Alg Futures Lab on Twitter. And I would just like to thank Benedetta again and all of you, and hope that you have a very pleasant evening. So thank you very much, everyone.